All right, we're recording. So good evening, everyone, to our January 2021 Town Hall. And as always, our monthly Town Halls for this year are generously sponsored by QS1, which is a red sale company. So we are proud of their continuing support of Illinois Pharmacists Association and our community outreaches through our networking events such as our town halls. and we're continuing to focus on COVID topics, and tonight is a very timely discussion of COVID vaccine hesitancy. And I'm going to turn everything over to Vedrea, and we'll get started here. I believe you should be able to share.
Yes, give me just a second to do that. I didn't want to do it before you
Oh no, you're good.
were done. Can everyone see the title
Yes, you are
slide?
good.
Perfect. Okay, so, well, we might as well go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Vedria Nikocevic. I'm one of the clinical faculty at Roosevelt University College of Health Sciences and Pharmacy, or our School of Pharmacy. And tonight I'll be talking about the COVID vaccine hesitancy. So before I even get started, I will tell you that this is a topic that we could certainly sit here and talk about for 2-3 hours at a time. But I'm going to do my best to cover at least the main points or the highlights of this topic over the next 25 to 30 minutes. So for Roosevelt students that are on here, I will be going at my OTC class speed, which is twice the normal speed. As far as my disclosures and conflict of interest go, I do not have any conflicts of interest when it comes to this presentation. We do have two separate sets of objectives, which are essentially the same. So by the time that we are done with this, I expect both the pharmacists and pharmacy technicians to be able to define vaccine hesitancy, describe determinants of vaccine hesitancy, and discuss strategies to address vaccine hesitancy. And again, same objectives for technicians. I want you to sort of think about a couple of questions before we get into this topic, and keep them in the back of your mind as we talk about vaccine hesitancy. So question one, true false question, pretty easy. Vaccine hesitancy is a simple issue that can be resolved by mandating vaccines for all patients, and your options are true or false. And question two is, of course, a select all that apply question in true doctor and fashion. And the question asks, which of the following can influence vaccine hesitancy? Answers are A, communication and media environment, B, community experience with vaccination, C, vaccine cost, and D, vaccination schedule. So before we even get into this topic of vaccine hesitancy, one of the things that I want to talk about are determinants of vaccination uptake. And what this refers to essentially is vaccination uptake is the number of people that receive the vaccine when the vaccine is freely available. So not at times like the time of COVID when vaccine has limited availability and we're prioritizing certain groups, but more so for the groups that have the vaccine available, how many of those patients will actually receive the vaccine. And there are 5 A's that help determine the uptake of vaccinations. The first one being access, which is defined as the ability of individuals to be reached by or to reach recommended vaccines. So are the vaccines available in their particular area? Are they able to get to the area where the vaccines are being administered? Is there staff that's available to administer those vaccines that's been trained appropriately, et cetera, et cetera? The second one is affordability. So are they able to afford these vaccines? Third one is awareness. So this is the degree to which individuals have knowledge of the need for and availability of recommended vaccines, as well as their risks and benefits. Fourth one is acceptance, which is the degree to which individuals accept, question, or refuse vaccination. And the final fifth one is activation, which is the degree to which individuals are nudged to vaccination uptake. And the reason I wanted to briefly go over these is because they do relate quite directly to vaccine hesitancy. And you'll notice that as I talk about vaccine hesitancy shortly. So vaccine hesitancy is actually a very complex and context-specific concept. And it was recently defined by the World Health Organization as the delay in acceptance of or refusal of vaccination despite availability of vaccination services. Again, vaccine hesitancy is complex and context-specific, varying across time, place, and vaccines, and it is influenced by factors such as complacency, convenience, and confidence. So when we're talking about each of these factors individually, confidence truly refers to the trust in the effectiveness and safety of the vaccines, the system that delivers them, including the reliability and competence of health services and health professionals, and motivations of policymakers who decide on the needed vaccines. And, seeing the COVID vaccines come through trials and seeing them come onto the market in such a short span of time, confidence is actually one of these components of vaccine hesitancy that's been pretty evidently shaken in our patients. Complacency refers to perceived risks of vaccine preventable diseases being low. And essentially, at those points in time, patients feel like the vaccines are not necessarily necessary as a preventive action. It can be influenced by many factors, including other health and life responsibilities that may be seen as being more important at that point in time. For example, if you have an immunization program that's particularly successful, such as the polio vaccine that was successfully administered to most of the world population to the point where polio was essentially removed from the equation, right? It's not a disease that any of us even think about anymore. It is likely that patients would be complacent if there was a need for that vaccine again. Or even if you have a vaccine, if you have a disease that doesn't seem to be as virulent as we would expect it to be, complacency might be really high. And then again, convenience is sort of related to physical availability, affordability, and willingness to pay, as well as geographical accessibility and ability to understand, including both the language ability to understand, but also the health literacy portion of understanding, as well as appeal of immunization services. And all of those can affect the vaccine uptake. The quality of service, whether that's the real or perceived quality of service, and the degree to which vaccination services are delivered at a time and place in a specific cultural context that is convenient and comfortable, can also affect the decision to be vaccinated and lead to vaccine hesitancy in a lot of different patients. So oftentimes when we think about vaccine hesitancy, what we're thinking about is either a patient wants a vaccine or a patient does not want a vaccine, meaning either they want all vaccines or they want none of the vaccines. And that's not necessarily always true. A vaccine hesitancy actually exists on a continuum. So we have patients who will accept all vaccines. We have patients who will refuse all vaccines, but then we also have patients who sort of fall in between. They might accept some, they may delay some, and they may refuse some. And sometimes we see that in cases of pandemic where patients may not receive an influenza vaccine on a regular basis, but then the H1N1 flu pandemic occurs and everyone is in line to obtain that H1N1 flu vaccine because they feel like it's extremely beneficial. And then there's that portion of, complacency is very low because the disease state itself is actually a significant threat at that point in time. So it's kind of important to keep that in mind. The other thing that we'll often see with hesitancy is that patients will receive one vaccine on a regular basis or a regular schedule, but then delay others. We see this oftentimes in children with childhood vaccines, with parents trying to space out the vaccines away from sort of the CDC recommended schedules. Or we see it with adults who maybe receive an influenza vaccine every single year, but then they will not receive a pneumococcal vaccine or a Zostavax or a Shingrix or a herpes zoster vaccine of any sort. So when looking at what actually determines the degree of vaccine hesitancy, the determinants of vaccine hesitancy are actually divided into three separate categories. And those categories include contextual influences, individual and group influences, and vaccine or vaccination specific issues. And I'd like to talk about each of those in just a little bit more detail. So contextual influences are influences that arise due to historic, sociocultural, environmental, health system, institutional, economic, or political factors. And they include things like communication and media environment. So if you have a patient who constantly watches a news outlet that is releasing information that is against vaccines, that patient is maybe more likely to be against vaccines themselves. Whereas if you have a patient who is constantly watching a news outlet that is very pro-vaccine, they might be more likely to be a portion to be more likely to receive the vaccine themselves. The other one that falls into this are influential leaders, anti and pro-vaccine lobbies. So again, if you have a very strong pro-vaccine lobby, you will have patients who are more likely to receive the vaccine, and vice versa with the anti-vaccine lobbies. And then obviously influential leaders. Oftentimes we see this with religious leaders. So many of you might have seen the statement that was recently released by the Pope regarding the use of fetal cells in production of COVID-19 vaccines that sort of tries to address this determinant of vaccine hesitancy specifically. There's also the historical influences. So one of the most glaring ones here is African Americans and the Tuskegee study, where African Americans were essentially told that they're being evaluated for treatment of syphilis and were never actually given the treatment for syphilis when it became available. So obviously this created a lot of distrust in the system between the African American community and the healthcare system, but also the government overall. And those influences sort of remain to this day. And oftentimes we encounter this as a barrier to administering immunizations to our patients. Religion, culture, gender, socioeconomic, pretty self-explanatory. Politics and policies, unfortunately, we do sometimes see that people equate healthcare and immunization specifically with politics or policies that they align themselves with, and that can lead to vaccine hesitancy in a lot of cases. Geographic barriers, unavailability of the vaccine, and then the perception of pharmaceutical industry. And one of the most common ones that I hear here is that the pharmaceutical industry is just doing this to make money. They don't really care about the people. I am just a number to them. And the government doesn't do anything to stop them from doing this. So we'll talk a little bit more about ways to address these in a little bit. The next category of these vaccine hesitancy determinants are the individual and group influences. And these are the influences that arise from personal perception of the vaccine or influences of the social or peer environment that person spends time with. So this includes the personal, family, and or community members' experience with vaccination, including pain. And I'm actually going to bump up knowledge and awareness to be right behind this one and sort of give you an example that encompasses both. So one of the most common examples that I hear in the pharmacy is, well, I got the flu shot and then I got sick with the flu. And I think this encompasses both because it talks about their personal experience, but then it also, to me, describes their level of knowledge when it comes to the flu vaccine and understanding how the vaccine actually works. And it tells me what portion of this I need to address in order to remove that vaccine hesitancy in that particular patient. There is also the beliefs and attitudes about health and prevention. So obviously, again, every culture has different beliefs and attitudes about health and prevention, and who we are and where we come from will oftentimes influence our beliefs and attitudes on health and prevention. So whether or not vaccine is appropriate to receive, as well as whether it's beneficial to us or not. Health system and providers. So we're looking at trust and personal experience here. And again, different cultures have different levels of trust into the healthcare system, but also different people have different experiences with the healthcare system. So if someone goes into the doctor's office on a regular basis and they feel like they're being sidelined or they're being left behind, obviously that will impact their decision as to whether or not to receive a vaccine. Risk benefit. So what does the patient perceive that risk to be? What do they perceive that benefit to be, or what they have learned or discovered that risk or benefit to be to them? And then the final one is seeing the immunization as a social norm versus seeing it as not being needed or harmful. And this is sort of where I'm going to call it herd mentality for the lack of a better word comes in. If you, again, spend time with a lot of people who feel like vaccines are unnecessary or vaccines are harmful, it is sort of more likely that you will start to believe that as well, as opposed to if you're spending time with people where vaccines are considered a social norm, you will start to see it that way as well. And then the final set of issues are the vaccine or vaccination specific issues. And these are issues that are directly related to the vaccine itself or to the process of receiving the vaccine or the vaccination process. So again, the risk benefit, whether it's epidemiological or scientific evidence that we're looking at. Also, oftentimes we see that people are more hesitant when there is a new vaccine introduced or there is a new formulation or new recommendation given for an existing vaccine. The mode of administration can oftentimes deter some people from receiving a vaccine. Design of the vaccination program or the mode of delivery. So whether the vaccine is being administered as a part of our routine vaccination program or a mass vaccination campaign. When you have a mass vaccination campaign, you're actually more likely to see a lot more vaccine hesitancy as opposed to seeing it with a routine program where you have a flu vaccine that's administered every year or childhood vaccinations that are administered on a regular basis. Reliability and our source of supply of vaccine and or vaccination equipment. So again, they're looking at the companies that are actually making these products, and if the vaccine is consistently available, they might make a determination about the quality of that vaccine or the quality of the vaccination equipment that is being provided. Vaccination schedules, patients do tend to be more hesitant about vaccines that require multiple doses versus a vaccine that requires one dose. Higher cost could lead to vaccine hesitancy. And then strength of recommendation and or knowledge base and or attitude of healthcare professionals. And I'm going to focus on this very last one here, the attitude of healthcare professionals. So how we position ourselves and how we actually approach the vaccine ourselves can play a huge role in getting our patients to understand the benefits of the vaccine or explaining the benefits versus the risk of the vaccines to them and sort of reassuring them when it comes to some of these vaccine hesitancy issues. So beyond these and beyond these global issues that or determinants of vaccine hesitancy, the WHO actually looked at a lot of different programs too. And one of the programs that they developed was the tailoring immunization programs. And this program was actually developed to provide proven methods and tools that can help national immunization programs design targeted strategies that lead to increased uptake of infant and child vaccination, thereby increasing the immunization coverage rates and curbing the risks of vaccine preventable diseases in any given region. And essentially what this entails is focusing on one specific group to help determine why there is vaccine hesitancy in that particular group, and then creating a program, an education program that will help reassure some of those fears, that will help increase vaccine confidence, decrease vaccine complacency, and hopefully increase uptake of vaccines. So one of the specific examples that WHO discussed was actually the Roma population in Bulgaria, where they sort of assessed this. And one of the things they determined was that oftentimes the mothers were coming in with sick children. So the illness was more important to them than the vaccination at the time. Because of the illness, oftentimes the vaccination had to be delayed to begin with. And on top of that, because it was the Roma population, so a migrant population, oftentimes the children were not registered. But in addition to that, they were actually able to isolate some issues within the healthcare system also that led to vaccine hesitancy, such as not having enough physicians available to handle the administration of the vaccines appropriately. So it's kind of interesting that there are these global programs that look at this as a whole, but then you can also look at an individual population on your own and sort of determine why vaccine hesitancy exists within that particular population and then address that specifically. And I think that's something that we as pharmacists can actually do within our own communities. So let's talk about how to address vaccine hesitancy. So IPHA actually recently published a document that talks about addressing vaccine hesitancy, and these are the steps in that document, and I'm going to go through each one of them individually. So know the facts, right? As pharmacists, we are the experts on medications. Vaccines are a medication. So we are those key educators about vaccines and vaccine safety in the community. Since these COVID-19 vaccines are new, we should really take the time to learn the facts about the development of the vaccines and be prepared to answer questions about what to expect, APHA has actually an entire library of resources that covers immunizations during COVID-19 to bring you the latest information you need. IPHA obviously has been hosting these town halls for months now, where all the latest information regarding COVID-19 and COVID-19 immunizations has been shared. One in particular that I would like to point out was the December town hall, where Dr. Miranda Wilhelm actually went through a really good overview of the vaccine development process for the COVID-19 vaccines. That is actually something that I have used when talking to patients, specifically to an MA actually at a clinic at the hospital where I was volunteering to administer the vaccines, who was sitting there administering the vaccines herself. And we were talking about it when there were no patients there. And she said something to me like, well, I'm giving these vaccines, but I don't think I'll get one. And so I was able to use the information that Dr. Wilhelm had actually provided during her presentation and explain why the vaccine was developed much quicker than we expect vaccines normally to be developed, and why it's available so soon. We also talked about possible adverse effects. We talked about everything else. And after, a half-hour conversation, that MA said to me, well, thank you so much for taking the time to explain all of this to me. I am now going to get this vaccine as soon as it's available to me. So it's one person that I impacted, but it's one more person that will get the vaccine that wouldn't have gotten it otherwise. So these websites actually have a lot of great information on here. Please take a look at them if you haven't already. I administered the vaccines over a couple of weeks at Mount Sinai Hospital, and we'll actually be going back there next week to continue assisting with that effort. And one of the things that I did before I even started was make sure that I look at all of the resources and I'm familiar with the information, because you can bet that all of our physicians will come up and ask questions of you as the pharmacist in the room. I can't tell you how many times the registration personnel walked up directly to me, even though there were surgeons, doctors, nurses in the room. They walked up to me and asked me a question about whether or not a person can get a vaccine, whether or not they should wait to get the vaccine, etc. To answer those questions without looking at resources, even now, this early on, because it helps build confidence. And I am getting a message that my internet connection is unstable, so if you can't hear me, please interrupt me. The next step in here that APHA recommends with regards to removing vaccine hesitancy is being proactive. So getting vaccinated is at the top of our minds because we're healthcare providers, but it may not necessarily be at the top of the mind for our patients. So really, as pharmacists and as a pharmacy team, we should be finding ways to bring awareness at the pharmacy and out into the community as well. So again, I'll share an example of something that I'm doing. I am Bosnian, and I know that people within my community are actually, many of them are very hesitant when it comes to COVID-19 vaccine for a variety of reasons. And I've been sort of looking at all of my community posts on Facebook, Insta, whatever, with all the concerns regarding this particular vaccine, noticed the hesitancy, and I reached out to one of the leaders within the community, asked if we could maybe schedule a time to hold an educational event for the community, but also reached out to a physician that is very well known and trusted within the community. And we're going to be putting on a talk at the end of this month to discuss kind of some of these issues, address them directly to ensure that these patients understand the vaccine well enough to be able to make an educated decision on their own. The other thing that we can do in the pharmacies is improve our workflow to ensure that getting that vaccine is as painless and as easy as possible for them, because this obviously, if a person comes in and they wait, 10, 15, even 30 minutes for a vaccine, they're more likely to come and get it than if they have to wait an hour or 2 hours in order to be able to get that vaccine. And finally, make sure that we're engaging our technicians, because engaging the technicians will free us up to do a lot of the other things that we can be doing at that point in time. We should also always be trying to build a trusting relationship. And honestly, if you're a pharmacist, this is something that you're doing every single day. If you're a technician, this is something that you're doing every single day, even just by saying hi to your patients, talking to them, learning about their families. You're building that relationship. Now let's build on that relationship by discussing the possible vaccine adverse drug reactions in advance If you tell a patient that they could expect an adverse drug reaction in advance, and that reaction happens, well, they're going to know that they needed to expect that. So of course, they'll be more receptive of it. You need to listen to concerns without judgment. And this can be difficult, right? Especially if you've had a long day. But sort of make sure that you are able to talk to these patients without sending out negative signals to them. Motivational interviewing is a great tool that you can use to help build a trusting relationship. And I'll touch on this a little bit at the end of my presentation. So we'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute. You should also address your own biases. So again, as healthcare providers, we understand the importance of the vaccine, but it's important for us to be engaged in conversations when we talk to our patients. Make sure that we're listening to them, and make sure that we are aware of our tone and conscious or nonverbal signals, so that the patient feels comfortable discussing vaccination. If they come up and tell you, that they heard this can change your DNA, please don't roll your eyes at them. Instead, listen, reflect back, and respond appropriately. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. Ask them about their barriers. So in that conversation with the medical assistant that I was talking to, I asked a lot of open-ended questions, right? So I asked things about, well, why are you so concerned about this vaccine? How important do you think it is for you to be protected from this disease? How confident are you that vaccines in general are safe? What have you heard about this vaccine that truly concerns you? Share your personal stories and experiences. So for COVID-19 vaccine, one of the things that we have actually done throughout immunizations efforts is encourage everyone to share photographs of themselves or their family, if they consent to it, receiving the vaccine. I think it's really important to do that. And I know several people on this call have shared their own experiences with the vaccine. I know some people have actually tracked their symptoms day by day after receiving the vaccine. And that's great, because people, if they hear that you are doing well after receiving the vaccine and you are someone they know and trust, they're obviously more likely to receive that vaccine themselves. I also like to tell people, as soon as I start talking to them about this vaccine, I was a little hesitant about it myself when it first came out. But since then I have learned, but since then I've looked at all of the data, I've listened to various presentations, I've attended every possible educational seminar on it that I could find and that I could find the time for. And now I feel extremely comfortable with it. And this is why. And then I give them all of that data that I've learned about. If a person says, no, I still don't want to get the vaccine, don't drop it. Drop it, don't force them into it, but make sure that you keep the dialogue going. So keep the lines of communication open, tell them their concerns are heard and valid, and sort of pick up where you left off the next time they come into the pharmacy. So again, motivational interviewing is something that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and this is a great tool that we can use as pharmacists to help sort of address some of our patients' concerns. This was developed by Miller and Rolnick, and it's essentially intended to counsel patients in a way that evokes their own motivation for change rather than putting them on the defensive. So simply saying, motivational interviewing is a directive, client-centered counseling style for eliciting behavior change by helping clients to explore and resolve ambivalence. And I'll talk about how they do that very briefly. So motivational interviewing has 5 principles. The first one is to roll with resistance. So in confrontational counseling, which is counseling that many of us start off when we leave pharmacy school, resistance by patient is viewed as an entirely negative phenomenon that must be overcome. And essentially, we try to argue our way into proving the patient that they're right. Rolling with resistance is actually trying to learn a little bit more about why the patient is resistant so that you can proceed on to addressing some of their concerns. So if a patient says, I really don't know why my doctor wants me to get this vaccine, I don't get why they're so adamant about it, you would respond with something like, you're not really certain that this vaccine is something you need. Tell me about COVID. How do you feel about COVID? Right? The next principle is expressing empathy. So whenever a patient expresses ambivalence or resistance to changing their behavior, it's important to reflect back their perspective accurately and without judgment, but also express empathy. So essentially, the message that you want to send to the patient is how you make sense of the situation matters very deeply to me. So you could say something like, it sounds like you're very concerned about this vaccine. I can certainly understand your concerns. Would it be okay if we spoke about them a little bit more? Avoid argumentation. Obviously, when you argue with people, they tend to close off, and it forces them to defend their own perspective. And the more vigorously they have to defend their position, the more likely they actually reinforce their resistance to what you're trying to get them to do, which is not a good thing for you. You do want them to develop discrepancy. So you want to see what it is that truly matters to them, right? And you want them to see how receiving the vaccine will enable them to be able to do that. So, in this case, I would ask something like, well, what has been the most difficult thing about COVID for you? And they might say something like, well, I haven't been able to see my dad because he's elderly, he's sick, and I'm worried about bringing COVID to them. Okay, well, do you know that one thing that I can tell you about the vaccine is that it's about 95% effective in preventing COVID. This might actually enable you to see your father, and then let them draw a conclusion from that. And then finally, supporting self-efficacy. So oftentimes what we encounter with patients is they feel like this is not something they can do on their own. And supporting self-efficacy essentially is a way of telling them they can do this. So oftentimes this comes up with diets, right? If a patient tells you, well, last time I was really good with this diet and I lost, 4 pounds over a period of 6 weeks, but then it all came back on, pointing out to them that actually 6 weeks is a really long time for them to be able to maintain that diet, and trying to see how they can move on and continue with that diet is what you want to do. You don't want to focus on why they failed. You want to talk about supporting their ability to succeed and continuing to implement that change. In addition to these principles, Miller and Rolnick also added some motivational interviewing verbal strategies. So the first one is to use open-ended questions. Second, listen closely and reflect appropriately. And our students will tell you, Dr. Brock constantly tells them, if you are reflecting appropriately, the patient's response should always be yes. You should affirm and support positive aspects of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Summarize the essence of patient statements and struggles, and elicit self-motivational statements. And this is nowhere near an actual overview of motivational interviewing, but it does give you some idea of what it is. If you have not been trained in motivational interviewing, I highly encourage you to pursue that training, and I actually do have a couple of links at the end of this presentation that will provide you with direct access to my training. I think it's a great tool for every pharmacist to have in his or her tool belt. These videos, I'm not going to play them here, but I highly encourage you to watch them. The first one is a pharmacist who is not using motivational interviewing. The second one is pharmacist who's kind of using motivational interviewing, but you can see the difference in the attitudes of the patients in the one interaction versus the second interaction. And I think it's kind of a glaring difference, and it explains the impact motivational interviewing can have. So let's go back to our questions. The first one is, vaccine hesitancy is a simple issue that can be resolved by mandating vaccines for all patients. True or false? Yep, so I'm getting a lot of B's, a lot of falses, and you are absolutely correct. This is false, right? Vaccine hesitancy is a very complex issue, and mandating vaccines will not actually help resolve it. People will still find a way to not receive a vaccine, right? Or may have a legitimate reason for not receiving a vaccine. But we can make an impact on vaccine hesitancy by connecting with our patients and ensuring that we talk to them. Question number 2, select all that apply. Which of the following can influence vaccine hesitancy? Communication and media environment, community experience with vaccination, vaccine cost, and vaccination schedule. Yep, so all of the above is absolutely correct. Communication and media environment, community experience. So what has someone around them experienced with regards to the vaccination? The cost and the schedule are all things that could impact it. So my take home points for tonight: vaccine hesitancy is a complex multifactorial issue. There's a lot of different things that can impact vaccine hesitancy, but we can also impact vaccine hesitancy by providing education and maintaining open lines of communication with our patients. Motivational interviewing, great tool to have in our tool belts. These are my references, and then these are the two places you can go to obtain additional training on motivational interviewing. And with that, Garth, I apologize. I believe I am way over time.
You are not way over time. You're right on time. And we definitely wanted to make sure we give a lot of flexibility tonight, because we know this is a very needed topic and one that I know many people will have questions. So I know there's been some lively discussion in the chat, which is wonderful. We always encourage that. But if anyone has any questions, please feel free to hit the raise your hand icon and we will unmute your line. And if not, please put your questions in the chat. I'm sure we have some great questions out there still. Not everybody at once.
So there were a couple of questions that came up earlier in the chat, and Rebecca, thank you, or Dr. Kastner, thank you for covering them. So the question was: a pregnant mother in Georgia concerned about DNA exposure to COVID vaccine, and mRNA essentially from the vaccine never enters the nucleus. Whether the patient is getting Pfizer or Moderna's vaccine, really there is no difference. The mRNA goes into the cell. It provides instructions for creation of the protein that it needs in order to be able to provide protection, and then the mRNA itself is completely degraded. So certainly not a concern. I think one of the biggest questions, if I can just keep talking for a second, one of the biggest questions I've received and I've heard for multiple people is, I'm concerned about this vaccine primarily because of the timeline of development for this vaccine. And again, I'll refer everyone on this call back to Dr. Wilhelm's presentation from December. She did a really great job of summarizing where this time savings came in essentially. But primarily it was in the development of the vaccine because we already had the technology available from vaccines that were being explored for other reasons. And on top of that, the federal government put in a ton of money in order to have the manufacturers make larger quantities of vaccine prior to approval, which they don't normally do because they would lose money if they made every vaccine that never got approved, right? So I think those are the 2 points that I have used most often with patients in discussing this vaccine to sort of explain why it came to market that fast and sort of allay some of their fears when it comes to that.
Looks like Jenny has her hand
Jenny,
raised.
go right ahead. Yep.
Good job, Dr. Roselli, raising your hand.
I'm a rule follower. Great job, Andrea. Thank you for presenting. So today in clinic, I had a couple patients that both had cited there was a news report apparently about a nurse in St. Louis that had passed away or had some significant reaction that led to hospitalization. I haven't been able to follow up yet. I haven't had time to figure out what they're talking about. I don't know if any of you have heard about some severe reaction recently that was in the headlines, but I had 2 patients today specifically talk about that.
And I have not seen that particular one, but one that was out there originally was about a nurse from, I believe, Colorado, and sort of the same situation. And that one, as far as I know, has been disproven. So to my knowledge, there are no patients that have passed away from receiving the vaccine. The other thing, and I'm sure Dr. Roselli, you've heard the same thing. that I hear from patients oftentimes is, well, what if I have an allergic reaction to the vaccine? And I tell them two things. One, at this point in time, no one in the world has anything that they know works to treat COVID. Two, we have medications that will actually treat an allergic reaction, right? Most allergic reactions we can treat. So Dr. Oh my God, he's gonna kill me. I can't think of his name right now. I can't think of his last name. Frank at UIC, the toxicologist, someone help me out here. But he was a toxicology pharmacist, specifically trained. And one of the cases he used to present to us in class was, well, if you have a patient who is dying and the only treatment that you have available will kill that patient, what do you do? And of course, as students, we would all respond with, well, you don't give it to them because the treatment's going to kill them faster than the disease. And his response was, you give it to them and you walk around them for half an hour with an EpiPen. So I told that story probably 30 times in the last 2 weeks. Follow check. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I approached it like, just talking about, we know what is happening with people who are getting COVID. Like that was kind of the spin I took on it was, what do you know about COVID if you get that disease? And so we talked about death and how tragic it is. And I'm like, and how many reports have you heard of anything harmful from the vaccine? As many thousands of people that are getting it already. And so it seemed like light bulb went on a little bit, but time will tell.
There is a question on, is there any support literature for pre-meds prior to shot? Nothing that I've seen so far. In terms of pre-medication, there was not a recommendation to pre-medicate with NSAID or acetaminophen because there is some conflicting studies for ibuprofen definitely that say it might help, it might actually decrease some of the immune response. Acetaminophen, no studies that I know of that say that. So if a patient really insists on taking ibuprofen versus acetaminophen, I personally always recommend acetaminophen. Yeah, Cody, I hear a lot of people say we don't know the long-term side effects of the vaccine, but we do know the long-term complications of COVID. And I honestly, I've also said to patients, but we also don't know the long-term complications of COVID because the vaccine has been tested as long as COVID has, right? At this point in time. So, those patients that we kind of know the long-term effects, what we're seeing is some lung damage, but will that lung damage actually develop into something more severe down the road? We don't know, and we can't tell for the time being.
And looks like I had a question in, to me, probably to the general conversation was, what about an active patient of shingles? Do we know anything, some of the recommendations about that?
No recommendation for a person with an active case that I have seen addressed in the literature. I will tell you what my approach would be. Anyone that's battling currently another infection, I would not give them the vaccine, not necessarily because of any specific risk, but because and this is my opinion, is that their body is already battling an infection, so it may not be able to mount an appropriate response to the vaccine, so it may not give them the protection that they're expecting from the vaccine itself.
That's exactly what Stephen Foster said. Dr. Foster said that's why he doesn't recommend getting a flu shot and the COVID shot at the same time, because of the hyperreaction you could have from both shots. And if someone's in an active case of any sort of immune response, that it's not recommended.
So, and that's just my general approach to vaccines.
He
overall.
also didn't recommend giving pre-Tylenol or NSAID prior to the injection. So they recommend, like, if you have the arm pain, after you've done alternating ice and heat, then maybe 4 or 5 hours or later in the day, you could take an NSAID if you're still having arm pain. My husband's arm literally ached for 12 hours after his first injection. And he had COVID, and I told him to wait 90 days, but the hospital wouldn't let him. So I think he had an accelerated reaction because he was only 20 days out from having an active COVID infection, but it took him about 12 hours. He felt like he had COVID again for 12 hours.
And some patients have reported, even at my hospital, we've heard from some patients that they're developing a reaction either after beginning 12 hours after receiving the vaccine, or having a more severe reaction. And by more severe, I mean more pronounced pain and fever. So nothing really severe. And honestly, to me, again, I am by no means a microbiologist or an expert on vaccines, but to me, having a little bit of a fever and a little bit of pain tells me the vaccine is working, right? Because what your body does when something foreign or unknown to it enters the body, it mounts an immune response. And that immune response results in a fever. It results in a little bit of a pain in whatever area that pathogen or that unknown organism enter your body in. So I always sort of explain that to patients. There are a couple of questions that were direct message to me. One is, I've just had a case of COVID for the second time last week. When should I get the vaccine for the most protection? So I actually just looked at this recommendation before I started this. The CDC is saying that they feel the protection from having COVID will last for up to 90 days. So you can delay vaccination for up to 90 days. What I would recommend, depending on the type of vaccine that you're getting, is that you start with the first dose before your protection in a manner so that your protection is complete before your natural immunity wanes off. Let's put it that way. So me personally, I'm saying 2 weeks before your 90 days are up for the first dose, at least, if not 3.
Now I'm interested in the second wave of COVID that this person has had. If they could text you privately so that they don't have to. So how many weeks between the 2 infections was it?
I can tell you it's been a while.
Yeah, it was me. So I actually got it when it all started. And then I just got it like 3 weeks ago again. Everyone at my work was positive, and then I started getting the symptoms again. And I'm like, no, this can't be, this can't be again. And then
so I have two theories. It all depends on the amount of viral load and exposure you got in the first time. Secondly, because of the big wave we got September and October, all of a sudden we were doing really well, and then they blamed it on people having parties. The peak that we got in September and October is the same peak that England got. So I feel, and based on the discussions I've been involved with, I think we got the second variants of it in September and October because people started flying internationally again. And I think that second wave. My third theory about this is I myself had COVID, secondary to my husband bringing it home. So for 5 days, I had hardly anything and I was fine. We literally thought it was over. And then I had like a little rest and then it came back. So I had a biphasic, it came back with a vengeance the second time around. It wasn't that I got reinfected. It was just that I handled it and something in my system. And then Garth will tell you, I thought I was going to die. No, but now I can't. So if I overextend myself, I want to be in my bed on my heating pads because I'm shivering and I'm tired. So I just think if you try to burn the candle at both ends and ignore the fact that you just got a light case of COVID, I think the COVID comes back and reminds you that it's meaner than we think it is. So,
Brittany, if you're comfortable sharing, were your symptoms worse the first time around or the second?
Yeah, I want to know more.
They were a lot worse the first time I got it. But I'm immunocompromised. I'm on a lot of steroids and stuff like that. So that's why I think I did get it again, because I didn't have that really big immune reaction to it the first time. And so yeah, the first time I got it, I was in the hospital. It was bad. And then the second time it really wasn't as bad, but it still wasn't fun.
And the other thing with that, and Starlin, you might be trying to say the same thing, but we also don't know whether the vaccine response will be as significant in patients who are immunocompromised either, because that is not something that has been studied.
We do have a rather large group who were HIV positive, and some rheumatoid arthritis patients are, Pfizer has rheumatoid arthritis patients and Moderna has HIV patients that they don't have the results back on that but I'm very, very interested in that. So Brittany, I just want to thank you so much for sharing, because we're all learning, and the more we know, the better we all are. Has anybody, I don't know if anybody's been on the Pharmacist Mom site, but there was probably like 6 or 7 people showing their arms from the injection. They had like, it looked like a little psoriasis reaction down from their injection site with the Moderna injection. Has anybody experienced that in real life?
I saw that too. I'm on there a lot, and the students will tell you I talk about Pharmacist Moms in class all the time. But one of the things that I did see someplace, and I can't remember where I saw it, was that one of these vaccines is actually reconstituted and or uses the same adjuvant as the Shingrix does. And we did see a lot of these vaccine reactions with Shingrix as well that were more significant, both at the injection site, but also the higher fevers and grade 3 diarrhea that was occurring with those. So I saw it in passing someplace. I meant to go back and look at it, and now that you said it, I thought of it again. There are a couple of other questions. One is, I have a few friends and family members that are hesitant to get the vaccine, and I want to educate them, but find myself stuck between arguing and informing. Any suggestions? So I think, one of my biggest suggestions is, when you find yourself arguing, is walk away and come back to it when you have had an opportunity to calm down and sort of think about the things that they said to you right before they went into the argument, or that they said to you as they were arguing with you, and then research responses to those specific things and see if that might actually help sort of reassure them in a way. Stephanie, I see your hand is up. You'll just need to unmute, please.
Yeah.
Hey,
Stephanie,
yeah,
you can,
it's
there you go.
Stephanie. I recently was tested. Let me take out, I'm sorry, I'm joined twice. I was recently tested for the serology, and I do have antibodies. So sometime along the way, I had COVID. So my question is there any quantitative studies? How much antibodies would be considered protective versus, what level do I look at as a drop to say, okay, now I'm no longer protected? Is there a quantitative study on serology?
That's a great question. I have not seen one so far, but I would assume they would have some of that information, honestly. Maybe even from, well, not necessarily based on the infections, but based on the vaccine, to determine how effective the vaccines were. They needed to figure out.
Yeah, that's my thing too. So if my level is, 2.0, and the vaccine after, 45 days, you're at 2.0, does that mean protection? And then if you drop to, 1, are they looking at that along the way? And should I be a person to be last in line for the vaccine? Since I do have antibodies, should I not push to the front of the line where there's other people who may not have antibodies?
I'll tell you what I would tell my mom. I would say, get the vaccine as soon as you're eligible for it, unless you are absolutely sure that, of the time frame where when you had COVID, I would say just get the vaccine as soon as you're eligible for it. Personally.
I know I rushed out to give blood. I'm like, okay, I've got antibodies. Somebody needs this blood. So the other day I went out and donated.
Yeah, I'm waiting because of watching my husband have the reaction, but the hospital made him get his because he's a trauma surgeon, and they wanted him, even though he'd had the COVID. They actually thought that he didn't have a bad case. So if you have a light case, and you're a frontline person, they want you to still get it. But I'm waiting, and I tried to give blood, but my hematocrit, so they said you need to keep your blood. So they wouldn't let me give my plasma. They said I needed it. So
well, you get an A for effort.
Miranda commented on here saying, I think the vaccine efficacy was based on getting COVID, not serology. And I believe that's true, but one of the things that I read actually earlier today was that they were looking at potentially changing the dosing for the Moderna vaccine. And one of the things that they mentioned was that the 50 microgram dose gave the same serology results as the 100 microgram vaccine. So I don't think they proceeded in initial phases of studies. I believe it was maybe phase 2 study that they were looking at. So that's where I was coming from when I said they might have that data. I don't necessarily know that that data has been published. There was another question in the chat. Should all other vaccines be separated 14 days? Yes, absolutely. The only thing that is published so far is to separate other vaccines by 14 days. So one of the things that we're running in at the hospital is employees who are required to have their flu vaccine done, and I believe the original deadline was December 1st or December 31st, whatever it was, but they had not gotten their flu vaccine. So now they were coming in asking if they should get the COVID vaccine first or the flu vaccine first. We're telling them to start with the COVID vaccine, and when they're finished with both of the doses of the COVID vaccine, get their flu vaccine. And the hospital administration has actually extended the deadline for the flu vaccine. And I think, again, it's a risk-benefit analysis for us, right? COVID seems to have more severe consequences, so we would rather they're protected against COVID sooner. It also seems to be more virulent compared to influenza. I'm not saying that influenza is not bad, but if we have to choose which one to protect them against first, we would rather start with COVID at this point in time.
I had one question that was in the chat that was, I think we may have addressed it, but I want to double check. It was, do we know if adverse effects are increased or more susceptible after the second dose vaccination?
What I had read from studies and what was that with second dose, they do seem to be a little bit more pronounced. So the fevers, the myalgias do seem to be a little bit worse with the second dose, with some patients even reporting that they were unable to complete activities of daily living for a day or two. But honestly, again, in talking to patients about this, one of the things that I say is I'd rather be out for a day or two with moderate effects, right, than be in an ICU, like one of the patients that I actually had come in and received the vaccine at the hospital, who was in the ICU for 3 months, and 2 out of those 3 months he was intubated, so, and in a medically induced coma. Do the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines cover different strains of the virus? Both of those were designed, I believe, to cover the same strain of the virus because that was the only one that was identified initially. And so that's what both of the companies were working with when they designed their vaccines.
Any other questions or comments? This has been a great discussion. All right.
If someone, sorry, I have one last question. If someone is expecting, would you advise against volunteering for the clinics? I think that's a very personal decision to make. I believe the availability of the personal protective equipment right now is actually much better than what it used to be at the beginning of this pandemic, at least from what I have seen at the hospital where I volunteered. So, my husband was actually very concerned about me volunteering to go in and administer vaccine to hundreds of people every day when I wasn't exposed at all. And his primary question to me was, well, why would you want to expose yourself now? You've been able to stay home. But I told him after my first day at the clinic, I actually felt safer being in the clinic with those 100 people than I do going to the grocery store when I have to go grocery shop. Because, so me personally, I don't know what decision I would make if I were in that position, but I think it's a decision every woman has to make for herself. If you are able to use an N95 respirator with a shield and, your gloves, and make sure that you're sanitizing every 5 seconds, please make sure that you consider all of that and make a final decision yourself. So I'm not gonna advise against it. The way that I am, I would likely end up doing it, but that is a very personal decision and I would not make that decision for anyone else.
And if you don't mind me jumping in, I'll just give you my personal experience. So I actually, at this current moment, am not vaccinating, and it's because my mom is staying with me after surgery who is very, very high risk COVID. And so I've had to struggle with a lot of guilt because I am that kind of person that would usually do it. But the reality is this is not something that's going to be one and done overnight. And so I know when, she's not living with me in 2 months, when she's done with her recovery, I'm still going to be able to vaccinate. So I think, it's a really personal decision, just like, Dr. N said. And I know that I've struggled with guilt around, not doing it. And so I just kind of want to validate people, if you are struggling with that decision, there are valid reasons to, to take certain positions and, do certain things and not do other things. In the pandemic, as pharmacists, we're so just by nature helpful and want to be involved in everything. And so it can be really hard when we're not being that person. And I can say that from experience. So even though I know I'm still helping people, but it's if we're not giving 200%, we're not doing enough. And so if anybody ever needs to talk about it, you're welcome to reach out to me and I can talk to you about it as well. But there are a lot of there's everything in between on the spectrum there. So.
Well, and I want to remind you that my husband was doing a trauma and he was doing an open fracture and was in a bunny suit. So when they do orthopedic surgery on and it's an open fracture, they gown up and have the respirator and everything on. And through that, he still got exposed. So you can't be careful enough, and we don't know enough about, all the details, because initially they said, his first test came back negative and they didn't retest him for 5 more days. And within that 5 days, he turned positive. But they said it was highly impossible that he would have contracted it, but he did. And it was from that trauma patient. So I think you're smart, Rebecca, being with your mom. So.
And again,
I appreciate that.
I am relatively low risk. Most of the people in my household are, my children are healthy. My husband is relatively healthy, and he is honestly exposed every day more than I am when I'm at the clinic. So to me, this is a decision that makes sense. But I absolutely agree with everything that was said here. There is one last question, sorry. How do you keep your family safe after volunteering? And I think that's a really great question that everyone has sort of been wondering, and I'll refer back to Pharmacist Moms Group. Starlin and I have been reading those posts all the time about the pharmacists who come home. And actually, I have a friend who's a pediatric nurse at Northwestern as well. And we both do sort of the same thing. She actually undresses in the garage before even getting into the house, leaves everything into the garage and runs straight into the shower. I literally walk in and my first stop is the laundry room. My 9 and 10-year-old know not to come anywhere near me when I'm coming back from clinic. So I go into the laundry room, all of the clothes I was wearing go straight into the washer, and I go into the shower. And to me, I do the best I can. And those of you that know me, I'm slightly OCD, or maybe slightly more than slightly OCD. So even under normal conditions, I'm always sanitizing. I'm always washing my hands. My daughter is hilarious because she actually said to me the other day when I came back from clinic, she had forgotten and she started running up to me and I'm like, stop, stop, stop. I was at the hospital today. And she's like, but mommy, you're always so careful. I would be really surprised if you got COVID. So, but I think we're all just doing the best we can. And whether you're immunizing or you're working in a pharmacy or you're working from home, or honestly, or you're just taking care of your family and bringing them groceries or ordering them for them on Instacart, we're doing the best we can. And that's all we can do at this point in time. So you shouldn't feel bad about any of it.
Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful discussion. I do want to thank Bedrea again for taking such a long, extended discussion time period, but I think we needed it. I think we had a lot of great questions we needed to get through, and I really greatly appreciate you putting this together. I know we kind of put you on a short time frame, so again, thank you again. I do want to put the evaluation link in there, and I'm going to pause the recording as I give the code here really quick.
Can I give two special
All right.
while everyone
Go ahead,
writes
I'm
down
sorry.
the code real quick? One to James Cody Sandusky for coming up with the idea for the town hall. So thank you very much. This was a great topic, and he was the one who suggested it. Two to Jenny Lynch Roselli for actually supporting me in doing all of this, and Cara Brock for being my never-ending editor on presentations.
Excellent. Team efforts, always. So, thank you. And we do have a couple other quick things we do need to go through. I know that we're past the 8 o'clock hour, but we do need to squeeze in a couple of big points here. First, I'm going to turn it over to Cody Sandusky so he can kind of give a mini commercial about if you want to continue talking about vaccine hesitancy and the experience of working with trying to get your team vaccinated.
Sure. So thank you, Bedrea. That was very good. And no one ever calls me James, so I feel honored you even know what my name is. So tomorrow at 12 noon Central Time, APHA is having their weekly town hall with President Michael Hogue, and he's invited a couple of pharmacists from rural America to talk about their experience, and one of those people would be me. So we're going to be talking about our education campaign we did at Harrisburg, which goes wonderfully with this presentation, like you said, how we were able to kind of turn the vaccine hesitancy around pretty quickly, really. So that's kind of what we're going to be discussing, and then just giving our overall experience here in small town America, what it's like to try and vaccinate the public. So if you're interested, Garth's got the link there in the chat, and I would love to see a strong IPHA presence there. That would be awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And just want to make sure, as you know, I know many of you who have gotten vaccinated have posted pictures on social media. If you want and you don't have an issue, please forward those on to the association. We'll be glad to put those photos up and share those to kind of help keep a positive public momentum going. And I know some of you are starting to get those today. I'm 10 hours past vaccination, and really, I can't even tell. I had a little soreness in my arm for a couple hours, but so far so good. So we'll see how it goes. But I want to just go over a quick couple of state-related items, and then we'll let you ask any other questions, and then we'll adjourn for this evening. So let me switch over to my PowerPoint here. The first thing that I want to make sure is that Governor Pritzker today announced that third tier mitigations were going to start being able to be reduced starting January 3rd, or excuse me, January 15th. So that'll be next week. And he also announced phase 1B vaccination distribution, which I've talked to a couple people this evening with public health, and they wish he wouldn't have talked about it because it's already getting a lot of questions. Like, people think it's ready to be activated, which, we're far, far away from even looking at activating phase 1B yet. But I really wanted to make sure to point this out here. This is something that's unusual. I thought when ACIP put out recommendations and the CDC approved them, they were pretty much edicts and they weren't changeable, but it seems like governors are allowed to amend them with the way we're rolling out with the COVID vaccine. And Governor Pritzker has decided to kind of merge in phase 1C into 1B. So if you remember, if you've seen some of the information we put out about phase 1B when it was approved, it was to be frontline essential workers and those 75 years of age and older. But Governor Pritzker has decided to include those 65, which were 65 to 74, were supposed to be left for phase 1C, but the governor has decided to put them into phase 1B. So that puts us at about, almost 3 million people that we're going to have to vaccinate. I can't stress this enough. I had a very good, productive conversation with the chief medical officer this evening, and she's really encouraging pharmacies, if you have not signed up for eye care, stop whatever else you're doing and get it done. We have to get pharmacies in eye care. If you talk to your pharmacy colleagues and they're not in eye care, they have to do it now. It's not a quick process. The department is putting additional employees on it, and we have to get everybody signed up, or you're going to get passed over for allocation. It's going to be that plain and simple. So we really have to keep putting pressure on our peers to get them to make sure they're ready to go. We've said pharmacy is going to be the solution to this problem, and we have to be able to be there when they ask for it, and they're asking us to be ready, and we have to be there. Or we're going to have to continue to deal with issues like the RFP that we dealt with earlier this week. We will continue to provide updates through the COVID-19 Vaccine Resource Guide. We will, the Vaccine Resource Guide, we just compiled various resources from the state and federal, and if you find some good resources that you feel need to be in there, please email them to the office so we can include them in there. We've tried to we know it's not comprehensive, but we've tried to do our best with trying to give you a one-stop resource that's a little bit better organized than trying to go through Google or look through some other websites that are out there. So please utilize the resource guide. It really will help you with getting some of the quick information that you need. I know we're at 8:15, but someone's asking. Let's see here. I know there's some questions about eye care, about individual providers, and that's some of the questions we're going to have to get cleared up with them. Right now, if you are an individual pharmacist provider, they are not wanting to give you access. They want you to do it under a corporation, and that's something that we still have to address with them because I'm sure they're not doing that for physicians. So we need some type of parity whenever it comes to that. Because I actually got rejected trying to apply because we weren't, and I said, well, I'll be part of other vaccination efforts under different pharmacy organizations and community health projects. And so they said, well, they want pharmacists to utilize the registry under those established corporations that have access. And I said, well, that kind of goes against what HHS Third Amendment says, that the individual pharmacist has to review the registry record prior to administration. So it does put up some interesting hurdles that we'll continue to work with the Department of Public Health on. Again, someone asked if we need to have your own MPI number. Yes, as Starla and I would have told you, you should have had that in October of 2005. And so a lot of us have had our numbers since we've been able to get them. And some of us have done it out of spite and been wanting to use it. And folks, this is the time. It's finally here. I know a lot of us, we've had to dust off our number and look it back up so we knew what it was again. But this is the time. If not, go ahead and fill out on the HHS website to complete your NPI number so you have that for billing. And doesn't take that long to complete the process on it. And again, it's completely free, so you don't have to worry about that. Someone is asking if I can clarify whether or not to give COVID vaccine. Oh, if we need 2 hours of ACPE vaccine CE to do so. You do need to get an update on that. I would recommend finding a couple of resources. We're working on a couple of solutions to have posted. So you do need to have that. And it doesn't say you have to have it before. It just says you have to have the 20 hours and that you have to have the 2 hours complete every year. I know a lot of people are having some questions about that. If you need to, please direct them to me, and I'll be glad to help answer some of their questions. Let's see here.
Garth, sorry, just to clarify, was that every year or every licensing period? I thought it was every.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I thought it was every licensing period. So like with every CE cycle, every 2 years.
I think it is, but I've heard interpretations of every year. So it's kind of one of those, we may be just safer than sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, everyone. I know there's some good last-minute questions. I think we've answered them all. If any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me here at the office. And I know just continue. If you haven't, one thing that we have started since the last time we got together, we have started reissuing small doses, which is our monthly newsletter drop to kind of keep you up to date with what's going on with the association. And also we've released a new alert communication called VaxFacts. So thank you, Jenny, for that name, for the new communication. And so we're using that to try with anything that's specific on the COVID vaccine. So, you know, it's kind of like our farm flashes. So it's not about politics, it's about the vaccine. So keep an eye out on that. If you need the most current resource guide and you can't find your VaxFacts email, it is on the main website of IPHA.org. All right, everyone. Again, we want to thank QS1 for their continued sponsorship of our town hall. And I want to thank our well-attended town hall this evening. And we're able to keep most of everybody along for tonight, so that's great. And we will see everyone in February. And good luck till then. Be safe.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.